good to be with you guys this week. I'm excited to open up God's Word with you and walk through that each morning. I'm excited for next level after this. As Eric mentioned, college ministry is what I do. That's my job. So excited to get to spend some time with you guys this week. So I don't know how many of you guys were here last year when I got to be here, but those of you who were know that I kind of have a thing for bikes. Yeah. So, just a few months ago, I actually took my three kids, Ella and Hudson and Hadley. They're 8, 6, and 4. I took them on a bike ride. And we're in Stillwater, Oklahoma, and the church that we're a part of, Sunnybury Christian Church, their building literally sits right around the corner from our house. It's just like this 5-minute walk. And so from time to time, we'll grab some bikes or scooters and we'll make our way kind of around the block over there and to the church and the playground, and we'll spend some time playing on that playground for a little bit before coming back home. Well, on this day, we decided to do that, and so we grabbed all our stuff, headed out the door, and it was one of those kind of cool spring days where it's just cool enough that you want a jacket when you start out, but as you get moving around and get warmed up, you shed the jacket. And so we go out there, and we're playing around on the playground for a little while. After about an hour, it's time to go home, but of course, my kids have taken the jackets off by now, and they don't really want to put them back on. They're hot, and so they ask me when we go home, "Dad, would you hold our jackets for us?" And I'm like, "Yeah, that's totally fine." And so we start headed back home. Now the issue, anytime we go on a bike ride, is that as the dad, I want to make sure that I keep an eye on all of my kids. I want to stay close to all of them. They're still kind of young enough that they're a little bit oblivious to traffic and the possibility of riding out in front of somebody. And so I want to stay nearby all of them. But I have these 3 different kids at 3 different ages, which means 3 different riding speeds, right? And so it can be difficult to hang with all of them. Hadley, particularly the youngest, she's 4, and she's still in the training wheel stage, and so she can sometimes like move really, really slow. And then even if we're on a hill or if she kind of gets off in the grass, she'll get completely stalled out, like completely stuck. And I'll have to go back around and get her a little shove to get her some momentum going again. Whereas my older 2, Ella and Hudson, they consider every bike ride to be a race, right? And so the goal is always just beat the other one there, no matter where we're going. So they're always going as fast as they can. And so it can be a challenge. I want to stay close to Hadley. I want to stay close to them, but that can get difficult. And on this particular day, we're riding back, and we run this sidewalk that we're on runs next to a fairly busy street called Richmond Road. And so I'm always trying to be careful there. But on this sidewalk, we're going, and sure enough, Hadley gets stuck behind me. She gets kind of stuck there in the grass, and so I got to turn around, and I set all the jackets down, and I grab her scooter or her bike, and I start to get her going. I give her a little bit of shove and get her some momentum, and then I reach down and I pick up the jackets, and I look up, and what I realize is in that short little period there, just those 30 seconds, whatever, my older 2 have taken off. And I look up and they are flying. They are so far out, I actually call out for them to slow down, but they're already out of earshot. They're that far in front of me, and they're about to turn onto the street that goes into our neighborhood. And so I realize now that I've got some ground that I'm going to have to make up if I'm going to try and catch up with them. And so I get all my stuff together, and here's the part I haven't actually told you yet. I don't actually own a bike, and that might be surprising to some of you, but I don't actually own a bike. And so in order to be able to hang with them, in order to be able to stay with them without just sprinting and running the whole time, a lot of times I'll grab one of the kids' scooters, and I'll ride on that scooter with them to hang with them. And I know, I'm sure I look ridiculous a lot of times to the cars there at this 34-year-old man on a little kid's scooter riding around, but it helps me stick with them without expending too much energy, right? And so on this day, the scooter that I happened to grab was Hadley's, again, the 4-year-old, which is this purple and pink and white scooter with twinkling lights that sparkle when you ride on it. So I'm looking a little extra ridiculous to all the cars on Richmond this morning, and it's about to get worse. Because I see my kids way up there, and so I realize I got to get going. And so I jump on this scooter, and as I remember, I've got the jackets in my right hand, and I'm holding onto the handles with my left hand, and I get pumping and get my speed up quite a bit, and about the point that I get to like maximum speed on this thing, like peak velocity, I'm riding, and out of nowhere, all of a sudden, this handle here just pops off. So now it's just me and 1 foot on a twinkling scooter going at like max speed across the pavement, right? And I'd love to tell you that in my amazing athleticism and agility that I was able to kind of balance it and ride it out for a few seconds before maybe tumbling gently into the grass, but it was nothing like that at all. Instead, like as soon as that handle popped off, I went flying and jackets went everywhere like confetti. And I went into this sort of sideways Superman dive out across the pavement. And I could see it coming, and I landed on my left side. I remember particularly my arm and my hip taking the worst of it. And it hurt so bad. And I'm laying there, and I'm in pain, but I remember my kids are still up there, and so I got to get going. So I get up, I grab the jackets, I grab the scooter, and I start to sprint/limp to try and catch up with everybody. Now, in that span of time, the whole accident and falling and picking everything up, in that brief period of time, actually Hadley has picked up a little bit of speed and momentum. And she has just made the turn onto that street. Not out of my vision yet. She's still there where I can see her. She's just turned, and I see that she actually, as I'm trying to catch up, I see her lose control of her bike and take it up over the curb and flip it over. And so now she's laying down out on the street. And so now I've got 2 kids that I can't even see anymore, and I see my youngest down on the street there in the middle, and I'm panicking now, and I'm trying to catch up, and I look down, and there's blood running down my arm, and I'm trying to get there, and I'm kind of freaking out. Now, unbeknownst to me, at this time, like all kind of happening together, and I didn't know it, but there's a guy in our neighborhood who actually also goes to our church, and he was starting to pull out of the neighborhood, pull out on our street actually, and as he was pulling out, he looked up and he saw my 2 oldest riding on their scooters there. And he saw that they looked like they were by themselves, and he thought that was a little strange, and so he stayed there in his truck, and he just watched them all the way until they kind of made the corner into our street, and he waited until they made it into the driveway. And once he saw that they were safe and they were okay, he turned out onto the next road, and that's when he saw my youngest crash and fall out there in the street. And so he pulled up there, and he actually got to her right when I did. And so he helped me load the bike and the scooter into the back of the truck and to scoop up Hadley, and I set her on my lap, and he gave us a ride like the next 200 yards home to get back to the house. And so everything actually ended up working out just fine. It ended up being no big deal. But there was about a minute and a half of just sheer chaos where everything was going crazy and everything seemed to be falling apart. But here's the really weird part about that whole situation. I guess there's a number of weird things, starting with the twinkling girl scooter. But the weird part about that is when I looked back, there's a million different thoughts that go through your mind in that situation, right? Like I'm thinking about my kids and making sure that they're safe, the older 2, and I'm thinking about how bad my arm hurts, and I'm thinking about Hadley as I see her down on the ground, and I'm thinking about trying to not get blood on my clothes and on the jackets as I'm running. Now, all these things are going through my head, but do you want to know the very first thought that went through my head? It was brief. It was just like a half a second. But before anything else, actually, I was still in the air. I remember it was before I had even hit the ground yet. It was like it was slow motion, and I'm in the air. And I remember thinking to myself, man, I bet I look really stupid right now. I bet this grown man on a little girl's scooter crashing out on the pavement, I bet I look so dumb to all these people driving by right now. And it was just like that, and then it was gone. But I thought back on that later, how odd that was. That in the middle of all that chaos, in the middle of all that craziness, that the very first thing going through my mind is, what do people think of me right now? I say that's odd. The truth is, it's not that odd for me. Confession. I know a lot of us, we don't know each other real well right now, but I'll be transparent here. I am by nature a bit of a people pleaser. And so those kinds of thoughts, what do people think of me? Do they like me? Are they impressed with me? Do they think I'm good enough? Those kinds of thoughts roll through my brain more often than I would care to admit. It's one of those areas where I'm still trying to grow up. It's one of those areas where the Lord is still working on me, and one of those things I wish I could change so much about me. We're talking about what it looks like to follow Jesus this week, specifically through the eyes of Peter. And Peter's an interesting dude. He's a guy with a really big personality, and sometimes big personality can sometimes mean big personality flaws. And so there's been a lot that's been said about Peter, negative and positive, maybe sometimes more negative than he deserves. But I gotta say this, I gotta give Peter this one thing. I totally admire this. One thing about Peter is he does not care what people think. Actually, maybe I should rephrase that. Peter doesn't think about what other people think. Peter's the kind of guy that, like, when a thought enters his mind, it's just going to come out of his mouth. You know people like that? Some of you are people like that. Some of you are friends with people like that, and you've been in a lot of awkward situations because of your friend's big mouth, right? That's Peter. Peter's the kind of guy that if something kind of enters his mind, he's just going to do it. He's not going to think about what this might look like or how it's going to be perceived. He's just going to go for it. And there's sometimes that is a really good thing. There's sometimes that leads Peter into these amazing moments of triumph where he stands out above the crowd, doing the thing that needs to be done, setting the tone. And then there are other times where it leads to these really embarrassing failures. And then there's these other times where it leads to both of those things in the span of less than a minute. That's actually what happens in our story today. Today we're in Matthew 14. And we've fast forwarded quite a bit from last night's story. The disciples have now been with Jesus, following him for roughly 2 years. Following him all over the Galilean countryside. They've been with him a lot. They've listened to him teach. They've watched him interact with the crowds. They've seen him do amazing things. They've had conversations with him. They've been with him a while. But they still don't quite have him figured out yet. They still can't seem to get their arms around all that he really is and what he's really about. Now hear me, they know that he's special. They know that there's something different about this man. In fact, in the story right before ours today, Jesus just fed 5,000 people with just 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. It's this miraculous feeding of these people with this limited amount of food. And so they know that there's something different and special about him, but they can't quite put their finger on what it is. They're going to have an opportunity to do so in our story today. Matthew 14, starting in verse 22, says this: Immediately, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side while he dismissed the crowd. And after he dismissed them, he went up on the mountainside by himself to pray. Later that night, he was there alone, and the boat was already a considerable distance from land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. So Jesus sends the disciples across the Sea of Galilee, across the lake there, while he dismisses the crowd, and he says, I'll meet you on the other side. So they take off across the lake, and at some point over the course of the night, this huge wind comes up against them that they begin to struggle against. And a lot of people think that it's probably more than likely a storm, because the Sea of Galilee sits in this kind of valley surrounded by these cliffs and mountains and hills. And it's not all that uncommon for storms to form up on the edge of those mountains and then just rush down into the sea unexpectedly. That's probably what's happening here. And so they get caught in this, and they can't make any headway trying to get across the boat. And then Matthew tells us this in verse 25. Shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them walking on the lake. Now, I don't know if you ever think about this. I sometimes think about what would be the coolest of all Jesus' miracles to see. Like, what would have been some of the coolest ones to witness firsthand, like see with my own eyes? Walking on the water is at least like top 5 for me. It would have been so amazing to actually see what this looks like, to see Jesus standing and walking upon the surface of the waves. But I also have to admit this, that this miracle is a bit of an odd one. And here's why. Because Jesus never does miracles randomly or arbitrarily. He doesn't do miracles for his own convenience. Like, you'll never see Jesus create a horse just so he can ride it from one village to the next. It's not how his miracles work. No, Jesus' miracles are almost always designed to do two things. The first is to reveal something about him and his kingdom, and the second is it helps people, it benefits people. So right when Jesus heals a sick person, what that says is this is a man who has power over sickness, and his kingdom is one of wholeness and healing and restoration, and someone benefits. This sick man is now made well. But walking on the water, at least at first glance, doesn't seem to meet that criteria. It looks more like a party trick. Like Jesus is showing off to his disciples, check out what I can do, guys. It seems odd when we first read it. Here's what it continues on in verse 26. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. It's a ghost, they said, and cried out in fear. See, in the first century, the Jewish mindset was that the sea was a bit of a scary and chaotic place. Some even believed that it was inhabited by evil spirits. So when the disciples are out there on the sea and they look out and see this figure coming towards them at night, they freak out. But then it says in verse 27, but Jesus immediately said to them, take courage, it is I, don't be afraid. See, the disciples have looked out and they have seen Jesus, but they don't see him. They don't really see him. They see a ghost. And so Jesus calls out to them and responds to them, but his response is pretty interesting. You probably know this, you may know this, that the New Testament was originally written in the Greek and then translated into different languages for our benefit. And Jesus' response here, when he says, take courage, and then he says, it is I. That's two words in the Greek, ego eimi. And ego eimi can be translated, it is I. That's a decent translation of it. It's a pretty good translation. But more literally, the words ego eimi, they literally mean this, I am. Now, that's not the first time, that's not the only time that Jesus used that phrase in his ministry. There's this story in John 8 where he gets into this argument with this crowd about Abraham. And at one point during the argument, the people say to him, what about Abraham? You think you're actually better than our father Abraham? And Jesus says this, I tell you the truth, before Abraham was, I am. Ego eimi. And as soon as he says that, they all bend down and they start to pick up rocks because they're going to stone him to death for blasphemy. See, they know what he's doing right there. I am, that's the name that God gives himself in the Old Testament. Jesus is taking that same name and applying it to himself. He's making claims to divinity there. I think that this is what's actually happening here out on the Sea of Galilee on this night. But it's not the only clue that Jesus is giving him in this moment. Actually, the whole walking on the water thing is a clue in and of itself. Job 9:8, and I don't know how much the disciples were paying attention in synagogue school when they came to Job 9, but Job 9:8 says this, God alone stretches out the heavens and tramples the waves of the sea. So here Jesus is trampling the waves of the sea and calling out to his disciples, I am. This is no party trick. Jesus is revealing himself to them. He is revealing his identity before them, giving them clues as to who he is, and they see him now, but they still don't really see him. And it's at this point that Peter gets this crazy idea, and as we said, if the idea enters Peter's head, he's going for it. So this is what it says, verse 28, Lord, if it's you, Peter replied, tell me to come to you on the water. Come, he said. And then Peter got down out of the boat, walked on the water, and came toward Jesus. Now, this is a high point in Peter's life. He literally steps out of the boat and actually begins to walk on the water. It is this incredible moment. And Peter, to this day, is the only person aside from Jesus who can say he's actually walked on water. One of the greatest, coolest moments in Peter's life, and it lasts about 10 seconds. Because then, it says in verse 30, but when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, cried out, Lord, save me. So Peter's out there, and all of a sudden he starts sinking. But notice when it happens, it says, when he saw the wind, when he looked around at the storm and the waves going on. And what's happening here physically to Peter? is actually a pretty good illustration for what's happening in his heart. That in this moment, he is so distracted by everything around him that he's not able to see Jesus properly. And so he begins to sink and he cries out for Jesus to save him. Verse 31, immediately Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. "You of little faith," he said, "why did you doubt?" And when they climbed into the boat, the wind died down. So Jesus saves him and he says, "Why did you doubt?" But he's not talking about self-doubt. He's not saying, "Why didn't you believe in yourself?" No, he's saying, "Why did you doubt me? Why didn't you believe in who I am and what I'm able to do?" And then they climb into the boat, and Matthew says the storm stops, which is actually clue number 3 for his disciples. Psalm 89:9 says this about God: "You rule over the surging sea, and when its waves mount up, you still them." So Jesus tramples the waves of the sea, calls out, "I am," stills the storm in front of them. And then Matthew says in verse 33, "Then those who were in the boat worshiped him, saying, 'Truly, you are the Son of God.'" This is the big moment now. Finally, they see him now, right? Yes and no. The truth is, they see him more clearly now than they have up to this moment. This is the clearest picture they have of Jesus. But if you read through the rest of the Gospels, you'll soon discover that they still don't really have him figured out. They still don't fully see him. In fact, Mark, when he tells this story, ends his story by saying, "And they still did not understand because their hearts were hardened." Hear that? Imagine that for just a second. That these men have spent 2 years with Jesus, almost every waking moment of their life with him, talking with him, walking with him, eating with him, watching him do miracles, interacting with the crowds, and somehow they still don't see him. Which leads me to this really scary thought, that it is possible to be this close to Jesus and still miss him. That it's possible to spend 2 years walking the Galilean countryside with the man and still not see him as he is. That it's possible to grow up in church all your life, going to Sunday school and youth group and all of those things, and still miss Jesus. It is possible to come to an event like this and spend a whole week singing songs to him and surrounding yourself with Christians who know him and still miss him. How? How do you do that? Well, there are actually a number of different ways that could happen, but I just want to, as we wrap up this morning, I want to share 3 quick things that the Gospels talk about that cause people to miss Jesus. The first is this: a fear of losing control or power. And we see this in the religious and political leaders of the day. Specifically Pharisees and Sadducees who had the influence over the people, and they had the power and the control. But when this new rabbi Jesus steps onto the scene and a lot of people start following after him, they can't stand it. They hate that, and they fear losing their influence more than anything else. So much so that no matter what Jesus does or what he says, their hearts will not allow them to see him clearly. Now, I know that probably none of us in here have to wrestle with a lot of political power that we might have to give up. But here's the truth. If Jesus really is who he says he is, then following him is going to mean for every one of us that we're going to have to give up control. And there are a lot of people who cannot handle that. And there are a lot of people who, for that very reason, because they need to have control over their own lives, their hearts are never able to see Jesus clearly. Is that you? Another thing that keeps people from seeing Jesus is preconceived notions of who he ought to be, or presuppositions about what he should really be about. This is what happens with the disciples and with the crowds. See, back then, they had their own understanding of what a Messiah should be. They thought the Messiah was going to be this political military ruler who's going to set up a physical kingdom, the kingdom of Israel, and he was going to put together this army and conquer the Romans, all the Gentiles, and make Israel this amazing nation and set up a throne in Jerusalem and rule over the whole nation from there. That's what they expected. And they so had this in their mind that when the real Messiah showed up, they couldn't see him. Is that you? Do you have a picture of Jesus in your head that you hold to so firmly, this idea that you could not change, that Jesus, maybe this, that Jesus would never ever judge anyone for how they live? That Jesus would never tell someone to change their life and stop living a certain way, that he only wants us to be fulfilled and happy in our life. Or maybe a Jesus that cares more than anything else about America, about our country, and blessing it and making sure that we prosper. Or a Jesus that cares most about your political ideologies or your social causes. And anyone else who stands against that is obviously evil and wicked and obviously against Jesus. If you have a Jesus like that, one that cannot be challenged by what the Bible says about him, I'm telling you the truth. When the real one stands in front of you, you're going to miss him. The third thing that causes people to miss Jesus is being distracted by what the Bible calls the worries or concerns of this life. He tells some stories and parables about this. He talks about people who hear the gospel of the king and the kingdom and get really excited about it at first, but then the worries of this life, the desire for money, to be wealthy, the desire to be really successful and popularity, they chase after those so much that it clouds their vision and keeps them from being able to see him. Or it's not always bad things. Sometimes it's just bad things that happen to us. Some of you may be in a situation in life where things are just rough and you're having a hard time, and it can get easy sometimes to fix our eyes on those and not be able to see past all of the stuff going around us to be able to see Jesus as he is. So here's my question. Do any of those things describe you? And if so, are you willing to do whatever it takes to put those aside so you can see him this week? I believe this. I believe that Jesus wants to reveal himself to you this week. No matter where you are in this whole journey with Jesus thing, whether you've been walking with him your whole life, whether you just started out in this thing, maybe you're not even sure how you feel about this whole Jesus thing. You don't even know if you buy it yet. Wherever you are in that, I believe that through the preaching and teaching of his word and through discussions with your small group, through films or videos you might see this week, that Jesus wants to give you a clearer picture of himself. And I also believe this, that you were made for that. That you were made to see him clearly and to know him, and that's when you will come most alive. So I leave you with this challenge, that whatever it takes this week, whatever it might cost you, when Jesus stands in front of you this week, do not miss him. Let me pray for that for you right now. Dear God, we want to see Jesus. And so I pray that for my friends in here, this room, this week, that you would open their eyes, that you would help us to see your son as he really is, that your spirit would do that work in us, and that we would be changed when we look into his eyes this week. I ask you that in the name of Jesus. Amen.